Hey everybody, it's Professor Diffley. This is for History 110, Early U.S. History. This is my video for Unit 4. This week you have some reading to do as always. You can see the things here. You have the lecture slides with the notes, videos, 3 required videos that we're going to rely on heavily this week. There's a few required websites, especially on the slave trade, especially within Africa. Most importantly, there's only the exam this week, no discussion board this week. So just have to worry about the exam, and you can see the information there and on Blackboard. All right, so let's start with the lecture slides, a quick run through. So you can see the preview here of what we're going to talk about in here. The imperial rivalries and the battle for the continent, very much about the 7 Years' War, which you have in the video. It's a video combined with the Great Awakening. For slavery, a lot of it, especially the Atlantic slave trade, that whole thing. There's a couple of videos, very good videos on this, so make sure you take notes on all of these for all of that stuff. So for a lot of this, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that's not in the videos and really take a look at those more often. So the Atlantic system, this is just an overview title slide. So we talked about the origins of slavery in the last video. In the last unit, and so you can go back and look at that. Of course, as always, there are notes for everything, for all the topics here. In this lecture especially, the notes are really really extensive, so make sure you take a look at those. Remember, the notes are kind of like a text as well as everything else here, so make sure you read all of that. So the Atlantic system, this is what you knew as triangular trade. I'm sure you heard this. Network in the 1700s, starting in the 1700s, going through the 1800s, especially where it has to do with the slave trade of binding up Western Europe, mostly West Africa, and the Americas. This is a heavily reliant system on slavery. Indeed, just about everything coming out of the products coming out of this region, especially in the Americas, is somehow tied to slavery. I think even the cotton mills or the textile mills in the northern states will be using cotton from the slave area, so everything is part of it. Here's the different roles. Europeans selling slaves into West Africa, whom they bought from West African slave traders. And produced colonial plantations. Colonies, as we saw with mercantilism, served the mother country here, producing all these raw materials, and they were also consumers of slaves and manufactured goods from Europe. Africa provided slaves and consumed European manufactured goods, especially guns and textiles, and other things there. The role of Europe, again, produced, sold, manufacture goods, selling as slaves, consumers of consumer goods, that sort of thing. So make sure to take notes on that. Here's some more views from this. So yeah, just some more images, which you can see. This one shows especially everything that's going through in the different areas, all that, and that. So slavery in West African societies. Again, remember to take a look at the website, the required websites. There's a lot on this. Simply, just like everywhere else, there was slavery before. West Africa had a long and burgeoning slave trade for a while. The difference is it becomes more and more important to their societies, as Europeans and the colonists need more and more slaves. It's going to lead to more and more slave raiding and finding in West Africa as well. And so even as the European economies become more reliant on these plantation laborers, and so this becomes these plantation societies that need massive amounts of them, of slaves and forced laborers to do their work. But again, make sure you would look at the slides. Europe and West Africa, and again, Africa became a market for European goods. Europeans relied on African rulers to capture slaves. The European kingdom, the African kingdoms, West African kingdoms, were way too powerful for the Europeans to come in. There was always already a massive slave network going around. From within West Africa, a more traditional one. And so, yeah, Europeans really just established a trading post or slave factories or slave castles along the coast. That's all they were allowed to do, where the West Africans would allow them to do. Again, very, very powerful kingdoms in that area. And again, they rarely ventured in, and most kingdoms were, most captives captured by the Ashanti and others, And so what they did was create all these slave posts in there, and there's some images of them. This is one which you can see in there: Portuguese, English, French, all kinds of groups in there. You can see an African ruler bringing in slaves and other things there as they trade with the Europeans at these areas. This is the Elmina slave factory for it, and today in West Africa, it's one of the few that survives. It's a historical landmark, a museum. This is what it looks like from the outside. And just some more images. Again, there's more on the website about this area, slave holding areas, things like that. Yeah, and you can see this is where they were let out. Slaves were let out into the beaches to go on the Middle Passage, which we'll get back to. And then the Middle Passage here, this is the middle leg of the Atlantic Triangular trade routes. Very, very brutal. It's from Africa to the New World. Hellish journey. You know, about 12 million Africans were sent on this journey. You know, 1 in 5 of them at least would not survive. So there's at least 2 million, if not more, died upon the trip across there. And you can see the reasons. You know, they're trying to pack as many of the slaves in to increase their profits. Again, this is a chattel slavery where they view human beings as property. And so to them, that's this brutal treatment was somehow justified. But you know, slaves were chained to the decks of ships, you know, again, packed in. Diseases and other things would go, you know, run through the population on there. It must have been a hellish journey, to say the least. But there's more notes on this, and again, more websites. But you see how they design these things. Again, this is massive business back in the day. Don't forget that, as we talked about, economic costs. Is somehow they were able to justify treatments of humans like this as you know, on profit motives somehow. So just some more of the videos here. This is from a website on the Middle Passage Museum. And this is an artist's depiction of what it must have looked like. It's just horrid. So, one of the questions, and again, you can see all that. It's obviously not a very happy or uplifting topic in any way, any of this, but there is more information on there. Slave destinations and demographic distribution. You know, mostly they went after young adults and adolescents to pick as slaves. You know, and just think what this must have done to the West African societies to take the youngest generations for a couple hundred years. It's going to be a massive, you know, decline to the population. It's going to change society in many ways. But this graph over here, very instructive, though, of where slaves ended up. You know, for most of us here in the U.S., we usually think that there was a lot here, which there certainly was. But if you could see, they mostly ended up in the Caribbean and Brazil. So if you were an African being captured and sold into slavery, you would most likely end up again here in the Caribbean, where there was lots of sugar plantations, where plantation economies really began. So even though many come into the what is British North America, and today the U.S., more end up there, and even more in you know, less in Brazil, but more than here. Brazil also was very heavily reliant on these, and will Brazil be the last country to outlaw slavery completely in the Western world? Just some more figures on all this, just some of the historical artifacts from all of this. You can take a look. And, you know, the purpose of including them here just to show the complete inhumanity that was used against the slaves, and you know, the brutality of it, to say the least. And yeah, just the you know, how normal this was to people, which is so hard for us to understand, and rightfully so. But it just kind of gives you an idea of the way it was. So even though slavery here in the what is now the U.S., it wasn't the same everywhere, and so there are different slave systems developed, and it had different impacts on the people. You know, forced into slavery here. 3 main systems. You have the Chesapeake tobacco plantations, where one form of labor, organization, social, even mixing of cultures began. You have the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia, the cotton kingdom, the rice kingdoms there. And then you have slavery up in the north, which here the New England and the middle colonies. Again, very different lives for those involved in these different areas. Chesapeake was the largest and oldest of the slave systems. Yeah, it was everywhere, not confined just to large plantations. Everybody had slaves, seemingly, right? By 1970, nearly half the region's population is enslaved. Nearly half of the Virginia owned slaves. And they did all sorts of work. It's the most developed, because there's so many slaves, and it was the oldest they had developed, as you remember in the last unit, the white supremacist slave laws and things like that. So this is of course, a large system here. You can see some of the tobacco wrappers. And so back to this just for a minute. Here, again, slaves, because there's so many and because they're so in contact, close contact with Europeans now, becoming American colonists, there will be more of a crossover in cultures. They're more exposed to the European American ways. So these people, the slaves in these areas, are going to be less likely to hold on to some of more of their traditional cultures and things like that. But you're going to have very well defined, very well thought out, in the sense of developed slave laws and things like that. Again, they spend a long time, as we saw in the last chapter, figuring all of that out, how to ensure the white slave masters stayed in power. In the rice kingdoms of slavery in South Carolina and Georgia, originally they tried relying on Native American slaves, but they got rid of most of them by exporting them, or many of them died, unfortunately, from disease. And then when they began to is they came to rely on African slavery for the rice plantations. In a odd twist, it was often African slaves and people from Africa who taught how to plant rice well. And again, even today we've talked about how rice is so important to that region. It's, again, why is this called the kingdom? It's the enormous wealth of the rice planters. What you had here, because you work in rice paddies, and the work was much more difficult. It's very swampy. Again, you have rice paddies were filled with water where you grow the rice. The slave masters left their slaves to the task system. Essentially what this is, and again, it's in the notes, slaves were given a certain amount of tasks for the day. Once their tasks were done, they no longer needed to work. So they had very little oversight and supervision, where in the Chesapeake, you're going to have overseers, people in the fields with them. African slaves here were often out in the fields by themselves. But this will still, again, lead to most of them. It's Carolina is the first colony in the 1730s that has a majority African-American slave population, where it's not until the 1770s for the Chesapeake and that. So again, this is where the African cultural traditions really stayed. It's had a majority African-American population. As a result, these African-Americans had the maintain more of their cultural traditions, especially in language. Gula, which is unique in the rice kingdoms, that mixed English and various West African languages. So it shows you the resiliency of the enslaved peoples, how they were able to keep their cultures here and even combine them. Even the housing was different. You would have round thatch huts similar to the West African styles, where in the Chesapeake they would be living in what would look like cabins, the slave shacks. But if you had to imagine it more like a cabin. So here, again, you could keep more of the culture, to say the least, and a little less oversight. But dangerous, obviously, it's still slavery. None of it is good. So when you compare where is it better to be a slave? None, because you don't want to be a slave. That's terrible. That sort of idea. In Georgia, you also had this, but here, let's get to Georgia real quick. Settled by James Oglethorpe, a philanthropist and reformer. He started this, it was going to be for the worthy poor. This was going to be a place where there was no slavery. He was actually an opponent of slavery. Wanted to provide economic opportunity for poor Englishmen and women. He fought the vices, so alcohol was banned. So slavery and alcohol originally banned in the... So yeah, slavery is originally banned in the colony here. Again, so the British government eventually saw this originally saw this as a buffer against the Spanish down in Florida. Again, remember you had the Carolinas, which were a buffer. Now you have Georgia as another buffer, trying to take over the East Coast there. In 1751, Georgia became a colony directly owned by the Crown. Why? Because Oglethorpe and them lost control. It turns out that the Englishmen wanted alcohol and slaves. They demanded access to this. They were actually arguing, this is one of the great contradictions of this chapter, is they argued they would be denied freedom by not being able to own slaves. But that was their arguments. Remember that within all of this, as English men are claiming their freedoms, they're taking them away from others along the way. Eventually, Georgia becomes to look exactly like South Carolina and the Rice Kingdoms in terms of wealth, number of slaves, that sort of thing. All right, that is the last of this video. For this video, and we'll pick up here in the next one. Thank you, in part 2.